hopefully if I can get one person or two people to just think about life slightly differently and be able to look at those who are close to the ledge or walking up to the edge, and be able to just think about life slightly differently instead of being consumed with their present situation. Then my job would be fulfilled, in that I can help someone else.
You're listening to Seeking Refuge, a podcast sharing the human stories of refugees. This week, we sat down with engineer, author, and former Vietnamese refugee, Dung Duong, to talk about his new book, Shifting Optics. Shifting Optics shares stories from Young's own life to inspire readers to shift their perspective on the world and on their own lives. Your host for this week is me, Aidan Thomason. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Young. Today I'm sitting down with Dung Duong, author of the new book, Shifting Optics. Young came to the U.S. as a Vietnamese refugee as a child, and he is now an accomplished optics engineer and entrepreneur. His book shares memories from his life with the hope of inspiring readers to look outward and make the world a better place. So I'm really excited to talk to you today. Thanks for sitting down with us. To get started, can you kind of set the stage a little bit about your life? However in depth you want to go, but just kind of explain like your story of coming from Vietnam to the U.S.
I gotcha. So I'll give you thank you for having me first.
Yeah.
A quick sort of rundown, and we can go into depth as much as you want. So born in Vietnam, boat person. We actually left Vietnam twice. First time we got landed back in Vietnam, did the go to jail / get out of jail and left again. Landed in Thailand, homeless, went from refugee camp to refugee camp before actually getting to the U.S. Grew up in poverty, somewhat in Northern Virginia. Then we went to college in Indiana, came down to Austin for 3 months. I was going to go off to get my PhD, but decided that Austin was too much fun. Having spent 4 years in college, wanted to live life a little bit. Stayed with a startup here, and then slowly made my way up the socioeconomic ladder. Started a company back in 2005, raised 50 some odd million, and then I think the company raised a total of 80 some odd million. Then started another company, and eventually that got liquidated, and we now have some funds to invest in hopefully impactful causes that help the world in some ways. So that's my life in a nutshell.
So I want to kind of talk through, well, your life is in the book, obviously, but I want to kind of talk through a little bit of your life and then also about your book. So I'm going to start on life details first, and then we'll move into some thoughts I had about the book, if that's good with you.
Absolutely.
So I know you were very young, and I know having read your book, your experience as a refugee is kind of a framework for the book, even though it's not really just about that part of your life, obviously. But I know you were super young as a child. So what was that experience like for you? Do you remember it mostly? Like, is it mostly parents' memories?
So I think it's a little bit of both. I definitely have images of the first trip. The thing that always scared me as a child and was in a lot of my dreams was unfortunately the person who was seasick. I remember having nightmares growing up with a person with a green face. And unfortunately, that's the person that on the first trip was so seasick that he was just rolled up in a ball in a fetal position on a boat and eventually died. So I definitely have images. I have, there's memories of breaking my head, of being homeless, of being somewhat attacked when we landed in Thailand the second trip, and having kids, kick and punch me, trying to grab my last pair of pajama pants. So I would say some of the more traumatic sort of experiences of the trip. I have images, and I remember somewhat. But in general, I would say day-to-day life, I don't remember much of it. I don't remember much of really the thought process that went through day-to-day life. I can't tell you whether it was frightened to death or scared to death in those moments. I just remember having those moments. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. How old were you when you left Vietnam the first time, and then when you actually made it out?
So the first time was between 4 and 5. We didn't get to the U.S. till '82, which means I was around 6.5, 7-ish. And my mom had to spend a year. We spent a year in Galang because she had TB, and obviously the U.S. wouldn't allow people with TB in the country until they'd gotten their viral load down to a certain level. Mm-hmm. And of course, going from refugee camps. So yeah, so 4 to 6, almost 7 is a time frame of when we left the first time. Was in prison, later back in Vietnam in prison, and then when we left the second time.
So I want to because I know most of your childhood was in the U.S., so I want to switch over to that part of your life. So what,
sure.
I guess, like, what was the resettlement experience like for you? What was your childhood like more generally?
So childhood, certainly we didn't have, very much. Parents worked night and day. I barely saw my parents. I definitely barely saw my mom, even getting into my teenage years, because she worked all the time. My dad eventually settled into more of a 9 to 5, which is like 6 to 3. Growing up, those first few years were pretty, I guess I wouldn't say eventful in a good way. Certainly there was a lot of turbulence and trauma those first few years with just trying to make ends meet. Like, we didn't eat our first McDonald's hamburger till 6 months after we got to the U.S. And growing up, it was cockroach infested homes. Never knowing where your next meal is going to come from. But it was interesting in that during those times, we lived close to my elementary school, and I excelled. I became fairly popular. I was part of something called the popcorn committee, so I got to know the gym teacher, Mr. Michael, very well, and I would literally, get out of my class, get a pass to go to the gym early every Friday and go make popcorn and sell popcorn for gym equipment for Mr. Michael. Fourth grade, I excelled so much. I was taking fifth grade math. My homeroom teacher had a points program that I accumulated so many extra credit points that literally I took half a day off for the second half of the year. So it was a fun time. I would say at school. Home life is a little bit more difficult, but yeah, we worked through. I was even then I was helping my parents all the way up to my teenage years with collating mail to make additional income. My mom would get side jobs from her normal mail business or working for someone, and they would have overflow projects and we would work on them. Yeah, so I got pretty good at collating mail. I got pretty good at stamping mail. I think at one point I could stamp 1,000 envelopes in 15 minutes.
Oh wow!
And then I had it was 2 sheets of paper and a BRE, business reply mail, and I could take 2 pieces of paper, fold them, grab the BRE, the stuffed envelope. I could do 500 of those in I think an hour and a half. My mom was able to get down to I think less than an hour. So yeah, there was those cool sort of, well, I wouldn't say cool, but certainly moments where you did what you had to do to survive, and you progress, you move forward as a family.
So I'm drawing from your book, but trying not to spoil it so that people will go and read after. But one thing that stuck out to me, I guess, when you were talking about your childhood in your book is the different experiences that you had being a young child when you came to the U.S. versus like what your parents and other older family members went through. Could you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the things that came naturally or easily for me was the language. Most of my friends would say I can't speak English now, but that's a much different story. I got out of ESL in a year. My sister took her 3 years to get through. I just acclimated to the culture much faster than my sister and definitely my parents. So one of the things, the common theme that I see with immigrants or refugees in the U.S. is that the older you are, it's much more difficult to acclimate to the just the culture and the environment. Picking up the language is definitely harder when you're older, and just adapting to um, just the differences, all the differences that from one culture to the next can be difficult, and all that really stems from being able to pick up the language. And certainly, when you're my wife didn't come to the U.S. until she was 19, so her language skills are even worse than mine. So even now she has difficulty picking up. She's fine now. She works. She's doing great. Um, but like just nuances of the culture, it's still somewhat foreign to her. Right? Like going to a comedy show where is difficult. Right? She can't pick up on a lot of the nuances. So yeah, I think in general, coming to the U.S. or coming to a different country at a younger age is a lot easier than someone going to a country at a more advanced age.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot from students. I've tutored refugee students before, and I've tutored a high school student that was resettled, and then a couple of like kindergartners and preschoolers like around that age. And so that's something that I've heard a lot about like how difficult and different that experience is based on age.
And just another comment was just eating food. The U.S. The U.S. diet is different than other countries. But I would I can almost eat anything here in the U.S. now. But certainly my parents, they can't just enjoy the foods here as much as I can.
Oh, interesting. I guess I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, our food can be really rich a lot of times, to say the least. So I was really interested, I guess, as a student in my experience in high school and college. Could you speak to, I guess, kind of what that was like? I think you talked a lot in the book about, especially a lot about like identity and how your kind of yourself and your life kind of impacted your experiences in school in the older years. Could you kind of speak to that?
Yeah. So high school was I would say more difficult for me, even though we were slowly climbing the socioeconomic ladder. But yeah, high school was different in that I was no longer top dog of everything, right? So back in elementary school, I was fairly gifted as far as education, and I could still hang with a lot of the kids as far as sports. And obviously, by the time high school came, hormonal changes, just no longer being I went to Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Tech, so there were a lot of very smart people there. So certainly, I was no longer I never no longer stood out as being one of the top students, and just socially it was difficult. We had even though we were better than when I was in elementary school, we had nothing really um, from that standpoint. A lot of the kids had cars and just a lot more wealth. Right, they could stay after school, they could do a lot more things, whereas I couldn't. There was no outlet for or other activities than go to school and then go home, just because we couldn't afford it, and didn't have the even the transportation to do that. So high school was probably a little bit more difficult for me, and certainly being different, being an immigrant. I think there's always a sense of being I wouldn't say an outcast, but certainly from the outside looking in rather than from the inner circle. Back in elementary and intermediate school, you know, I grew up in poor neighborhoods, so um, I guess the demographics were more suited to people who are like me. Whereas in high school, certainly because it was a science and tech and more gifted school, the demographics were a lot different. All the kids were a lot more affluent. They were, just the demographics was much different. So I think high school was a struggle. And obviously at the time I had trouble with my parents too, having to rebel, having a little bit rebellious mentality that was instilled in me from English culture or American culture. So I went off to Rose-Hulman, which is 11 hours drive away from my house. And that I was, I think, the only Asian or one of the very few Asian in my class. Everyone else was Caucasian. I think it was 96% or something like that, Caucasian. But in that scenario, I actually fit in very well. I was, I probably spent most of my time in activities other than schooling at the time. I was in all the clubs. I was in a lot of the clubs. I helped write the Constitution of the Aero Robotics Club. I was part of the Student Activities Board. I played almost all the intramural sports. I was just around. I was, became a lot more active in college life. They say that one of the old adages that how you are in college is how you live your life as a grown up, and I think I sort of did that. I was very active, tried to help people around me as much as possible, and while still excelling at my academics.
I had thought of this question when I was reading, and I had planned it for a little later, but I think I'm gonna go ahead and ask it. But I kind of noticed as you were talking about your career path during it, and especially I think some of your earlier steps, you had kind of like a really, I think nonchalant is the right word, but kind of relaxed, like, oh, everything that was meant to happen happened, kind of about some of your career setbacks or like paths that went differently than you expected, which I think as a college student is super important to hear, because I think I'm sure you remember this from college, but like everything is focusing on creating that like 5-10 year plan after. So kind of what would you say to young people? What advice would you give them from having more of that kind of relaxed attitude towards setbacks?
So I think that's a great question, and one that hopefully my book sort of address, because I want my kids to sort of have the same sort of perspective in life. Right? So obviously in college there are many different types of college students. You definitely have the people who study, try to get the highest grades, spend hours upon hours, really trying to make sure that they're academically okay. You have others who don't care about academics as much, and you have the in-betweeners. So to me, I think it's all about keeping perspective in life. Everything in you don't want to be, you don't want to push yourself so hard that you're now everything in life hinges around whether you succeed or not in that one thing. You don't want to be stuck in not caring or just if you have one setback, you suddenly now it's going just give up. So one of the things that's helped me always is keep everything in perspective. Right? Life is not always bad or always good. I try not to let emotion and what happens day to day sort of affect me. And I think that came off as being somewhat nonchalant. And I hopefully it didn't come off as arrogant. I do believe in my abilities and my talent, but I certainly not to the extent where I'm arrogant about it. Or hopefully I didn't cross that line to arrogance. But in life, I think no one's perfect. So first off, no one's perfect. Life will not be perfect. The road to success will not be perfect. The road to finding happiness will not be perfect. And at every step of the way, I think it's very important to keep a perspective in life, right? It's not everything that happens at any juncture isn't all bad. Take a step back and look at how that situation affects you, obviously, but look at how other people might perceive that situation, how others may say or may look at that situation, and really be able to learn from it. I always want my kids to be independent. always be able to do anything by themselves and be able to grow by themselves and be able to succeed or fail by themselves, right? But any step of the way, they have to keep a perspective so that they don't continually beat themselves up if things don't go well, and don't get overly, don't pat themselves too much on the back if something is successful, right? I think keeping a nice sort of calm attitude to everything is the path to success, and keeping a perspective on any situation will help you conquer or move past those difficult times.
So were you in the moment, like when these things were happening, were you pretty good at keeping things in perspective, or was this kind of something you've learned as you've gotten older, like with the benefit of hindsight?
I think I would say the good or bad about this is I learned this fairly early on, but that's just because of all the stuff I've gone through. And so I would say in the moment, it was definitely hindsight way back when, but I sort of gotten that probably through my early teens and during high school, was being able to keep everything sort of in front of me. I think even during high school, I would be too focused on winning, on food, focus on getting that A, getting that that girl to like me, getting that being the top dog of whatever situation I was in. But somewhere in there, I sort of learned that I can't and I won't for every situation, and that having to sort of really understand that there's a lot more to life, right? I know the cliche about the journey is more important than the outcome or where you're going, but it's true. And sometimes keeping a perspective on that is important.
Just a quick question: was this your first? This is your first book that you've written, right? Or have you
Yes.
written? Okay. So was that? I know you've been like talking about keeping things in perspective. Did you decide to write this book because you wanted to share that, or are you kind of thinking of writing more in the future? Or
So I think this may be my only book, but we'll see.
Gotcha.
The original intent of the book was to leave something for my children.
Mm-hmm.
So my eldest is turning 11 in less than 20 days, 20 some odd days here, 26 days. So I don't talk much about my history or I sort of shield them a lot from this stuff. But I still wanted to document it and leave them something that they ever want to get back to it, they can. The point of the book was for me to essentially be there for my kids without being there for my kids. If that makes any sense. I sort of know that like me and my parents, I don't go to them for advice anymore. I don't sort of, I haven't gone to them for advice probably since high school days. I sort of know that how kids are. And throughout the book, I was hoping to leave, through my stories, leave little nuggets of wisdom that they can take and hopefully use in their own lives. And for me, it's important for them to be able to take the book and, if they come in across some sort of problem, and since they won't pick up the phone to call dad, because that's not what teenagers or kids in their 20s do, they may be able to pick up the book and read some passage that probably may not be germane to what they're going through, but maybe offer them insight into keeping a different, or looking at the problem with a different perspective, or seeing what dad's gone through or what other people have gone through, and hopefully helping them in their own, and find that their own solution to their problem. So the general goal would be for them to have something that they can probably hopefully glean a little bit of wisdom from as they go through life.
Yeah, I thought I was really touched by reading your dedication, the intro at the beginning. That was really well articulated and sweet to kind of want like that idea of wanting to leave something for your kids. And I think all young people reading it, even I know it's like specifically for your children because that's your life and like experience, but I think all young people can get a lot of wisdom from that too.
And that's essentially, when I first started, it was really just, I wasn't gonna publish it to the masses or have podcasts, and but when I was writing it, unfortunately a couple of tragic events happened in my life. One was my largest investment. His son committed suicide. And then 2 weeks after that, another friend of mine, his 20 some odd year old, also committed suicide. And that really sort of gave me perspective, and that I want to share this with more people and hopefully help kids other than my own to be able to just look at a situation slightly differently. I would say I have illusions of grandeur where I can probably pull people away from the ledge, but hopefully if I can get one person or two people to just think about life slightly differently and be able to look at those who are close to the ledge or walking up to the edge, and be able to just think about life slightly differently instead of being consumed with their present situation. Then my job would be fulfilled, in that I can help someone else.
Yeah, that's really timely. It's a huge issue for young people, and I see it rising every day, unfortunately, and it's really tragic. And I think especially the timing with the pandemic is fitting too, because that's definitely exacerbated the mental health crisis among young people. Yeah,
I didn't realize how big of an issue it was till I started, after the two events, I started looking into it. It's a lot more prevalent than I certainly thought. I didn't think it was. I thought that the U.S., with everyone having everything, that this wasn't a problem, but mental health is certainly a much larger problem than I would ever have thought.
It was a huge problem I noticed in my high school, but I think even just as I've gotten older, like kind of realizing that it wasn't just that it was my school, that it's like it's all over. And like you said, like you would think that it wouldn't be an issue, like with how many resources we have access to, but it's still just becoming even more prevalent. It's really tough.
It's one of those things where my wife started a nonprofit called Perspective Charity. And one of the things, I think I mentioned that in the book, but one of the things we wanted to do was connect children in the U.S. to sort of children in third world countries. And the reason for that is obviously the children in third world countries would get a scholarship and they would get their education paid for. But that interaction is important because we wanted to give children in affluent countries, and we're starting out in the U.S., but certainly it's going to grow, hopefully globally. Because I always tell her, if it doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. An organization has to scale to make an impact. So the hope is that the children in more affluent nations can sort of see and live and see through the eyes and understand how children in the third world countries live, and hopefully gain greater appreciation for what they have over here. I worry about the mental fortitude of kids these days, especially my own, and hopefully being able to see how others live, how others survive, will give them insight into their own lives, and hopefully they can cherish and appreciate what they have, and hopefully they can actually cherish and appreciate what they have and use it to better the world.
So I'm trying to think of I did want to touch on that, so I'm glad that you brought it up. I'm trying to think of like how to ask a question about it. But what would you suggest to kids? How would you suggest that they start, like opening perspective, or is it just taking those moments to interact with people that are from other circumstances, or do you have any like suggestions?
So I think certainly I could pitch Perspective Charity, and that's my wife's organization. But I think in general, one of the things that I learned that really helped me not to think about my own problems when the problem seems all consuming, is to go out and volunteer, to go out and do something that isn't part of your daily life. I think we've given food to the homeless people. I've worked in community where we hosted events for the community. Just doing something that's outside of your normal routine, and doing something that benefits someone else, making an impact in someone else's life. Um, I think will give you perspective in your own. There's a lot of need out there. There's a lot of people in situations that are probably worse than your current situation. And it's nice to have that perspective to see, um, you know, how big are your problems in light of everything else that's going on. And I think volunteering is a great way to help, and give back and to take from, because there's the feeling of helping someone else out is tremendous, especially if you see it having a positive impact on someone else. It's a very good feeling, and I encourage everyone to go try to experience it.
This is kind of shifting gears a little bit, but I think it's tied with what you just said. I was kind of noticing like that there's two parallel meanings of optics, which is obviously the title of your book, Shifting
Mm-hmm.
Optics. So can you explain what both of your meanings are for that word?
Yeah, so there's only a few universities in the U.S. that offers an optics program. I was lucky enough to go to Rose, which had an applied optics program. And even at Rose, one of the questions is, so what are you going to do with an optics degree when you get out? And the old, all of my friends would always make fun of the would you like fries with that sort of degree. Uh, so I added the mechanical engineering on top of that, just to ensure that I could have could have something else to fall back on if I couldn't find employment as an optical engineer. But for me, optics has been great. So optical engineering is a growing field. It's certainly something that is utilized everywhere. One of the hottest fields in optics right now is augmented reality. Your Oculus Rift sort of commercials right now is big. So certainly, optics from an engineering standpoint, from doing things like laser cooling, or just 3D and augmented reality. So that's one side of it. But the optics that I was thinking about as well when writing the book is just being able to look at through someone else's eyes, getting a different perspective on life. So that was that double meaning in the title. It's trying to say, hey, there's a technical meaning for it, but there's also really looking at life slightly differently. Looking at life through not only your eyes, but someone else's eyes, and hopefully seeing the world just completely differently.
So another thing that I picked up on in your, sorry.
Oh, I just said I probably went way too much detail into the technical aspect. So sorry about that.
Oh no, I think it's interesting. I just don't know anything about science or engineering, so I'm always really interested to learn about this kind of stuff. So another thing that I really kind of noticed in your book is you are very self-reliant and very focused on inner strength and intrinsic motivation, but you also are focused really on relationships. I noticed a lot of your job decisions would be based on like character judgments or relationship judgments. Can you comment, I guess, on how those things kind of coexist for you?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that growing up with nothing, you sort of put this barrier around, or this shield around yourselves. And one of the things that I learned or sort of developed is this inner strength to do everything by myself and not try to rely on others. There's certainly good and bad with that. In that everything I do sort of tries to revolve around how I can do it by myself, how I can move things forward, both from a from a physical aspect, doing things, literally doing things by myself, and from a mental aspect of making sure everything is emotionally tied to what I do and not what everyone else does. And in a lot of ways that can certainly be lonely. That certainly in a lot of ways that can be defeating, but certainly it's worked for me. Certainly the person I rely most on is myself. I don't see that changing. But in life, I think, unfortunately, you can't do everything by yourself, and you have to really rely on others as well, and certainly developing relationships to make sure that I find those who are very much independent, like myself. So when I ask or get them to do something, that I can pretty much, not be in their, constantly monitoring them or looking over their shoulders to ensure that it gets done. And that's important to me, that people are self-motivated, self-reliant, independent, and doesn't need sort of constant guidance. And that's what I've looked for in people through my investments, as well as just personal relationships. To me, it's people who can and are intrinsically motivated will perform better than those who continually need guidance or be told what to do. So it's just something that was forced on me when I was young, and certainly a characteristic that I look on when I'm older. Does that pretty much answer it, or?
I guess I was really struck mostly by how often when you were making, I saw the threads of independence, and it was just interesting how you were kind of saying, I chose this job over this one because I had this opinion of this person versus the other. It makes sense with talking to you. You're talking about how it's important to kind of put your situation in perspective with others being, I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think there's you never. It's very hard to know whether you made the right decision when it comes to choosing path A versus path B. And I try to make those decisions based on the best information I have at the time, right? And I think even in the book, I talked about no regrets, and that you can only make the decision as best you can at the time. And that's also very much so with relationships. And you go through life trying to find cues on what is the best thing to do, and that those are the situations where come up, and if a certain relationship or someone does something that's just slightly different than you expect, then I probably tend to move away from that and try to make a decision, all else being equal, with things that I know, with relationships that I know, or with people that have helped me in the past. And I think that's actually not uncommon. I think a lot of venture capitalist funding, a lot of how people make decisions are all pattern recognition. They've experienced a certain set of circumstances that led to a positive outcome, and they look for those patterns in their investments. And I think I do that as well. I just do that probably slightly on a more critical basis. And I really try to find people with that are similar to me, because I guess ultimately that's all I know.
So looping back around to the future. So I read your book, and hopefully our listeners will also read it. But what's on the horizon for you in the future? Because you've outlined a lot of your path up to now in your book.
So I'm always, I've always been passionate about helping the world, right, making an impact. I have, I think, close to 40 patents at this point. I've created jobs. I've started a company, liquidated a company, or started multiple companies, liquidated companies. So I think I've made a little bit of an impact in the world, but certainly continuing to make impact in the world. And one of the impacts that's to me pretty near and dear to my heart is something called Farm 2050. And there's a website out there called farm2050.com. And what it's saying is that population growth population is growing, and the amount of arable land is decreasing. So at some point, those two curves will cross, meaning that there won't be enough arable land to feed the population. And obviously, the website predicts 2050 is when those 2 points cross. I certainly don't believe it's 2050. I think the time frame is much further out than that. But even now, when there's more arable land than population, so there's we grow a lot more food than is necessary. There's still, I think it was the last statistics I saw was like 700 million people still go through a day without knowing where their next meal is coming from. So there's still a lot of hungry people in the world. So you can imagine what happens when those two curves get closer and closer to each other. So obviously, having been hungry, having been homeless, having been gone through life without, the 7 days without food, I sort of want to help solve that problem. And the company I liquidated certainly was a path towards that. But I think there's going to still need more to be done to really innovate and move farming and agriculture to a position where those two curves never sort of meet. The world will always be able to produce more food than necessary. So I think if my next venture, when or whatever that is, will probably still focus on that. I'm still dabbling in other fields as well. I think AR VR is pretty big. I'm helping one of my alma mater, I think, look into that some of that technology. But yeah, as much as I can help and advance the world somehow, I will continue to try to do that, and maybe even get back in the game of trying to do something for Farm 2050.
That's definitely something that's really, obviously, very, very impending. I think it's kind of been brought to the forefront of our minds this year with the pandemic, even though I know that the hunger crisis now is more about distribution than arable land this year specifically. But just the number of people that are going hungry because of the pandemic this year, that's an especially important thing to be on our minds this year.
That's actually an interesting other issue because of how efficient the food situation has become. And there's a company out there called Plenty. Nate Story is one of the founders. And his thing is growing food indoors, right? So that's the classic vertical farming, which I fully support, by the way. But his other big thing is really decentralized sort of farming. So putting, there's other vertical farms where you put vertical farms near metropolitans and provide fresh food to various metropolitans or around the vertical farm. There's actually even more talk of something called microfarms, where literally you have truly distributed farming, where now instead of having really large corporations ship all your broccoli to Chicago before it gets distributed to the rest of the country, or shipping all the cattle to Chicago before shipping to the rest of the country, you have very local farms that provide food only to the area. Unfortunately, that model means more expensive food, but it also means the hunger crisis sort of. I think back when COVID first happened, they had to call a bunch of cattle and a bunch of pigs because of the food processing plant being shut down. It was more expensive to try to ship the animals back to their ranch than to just essentially kill them. So that sort of thing. If you have a decentralized sort of farming system, that could help.
So that was actually all of the questions that I had for you. Is there anything else that's on your mind or anything that you'd like to say before we kind of wrap up?
I think it was a great interview. Thank you for having me. Glad I was able to talk to various things within my book and outside of my book. I just want to thank your audience for listening.
That was author Dung Duong talking to us about his life and his new book, Shifting Optics. His book can be purchased on Amazon or at most major booksellers. If you like this episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review us in the comments below. If you'd like to get in touch with us, email us at seekingrefugepodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook @Refuge Podcast for all the updates on our show. As always, Thank you to Maxi International House for making our show possible. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.